really glad that you're taking time to be here. So I just want to welcome you all to the webinar on leading through loss. And I've got a PowerPoint that I'm going to bring up in just a minute. And because I'm a visual person, so there's a lot of visual things that you can follow along with it. And I'm going to keep a pretty good clip because I originally, as I was thinking about something like this, it was designed to be more of a retreat kind of environment. But we have an hour, so we're going to cover some stuff. But I have contact information at the end of the hour where if you want to call me and continue the conversation, I would be glad to do that with you. And anything I can do to help, because we are very much in all of this together. So let's see here. Okay. So Cindy is monitoring the chat, and you can ask your questions or make comments or snide remarks if you want. And I would invite you to mute your microphones unless you are going to say something when you're called upon. That way we don't have a lot of ambient noise, because I'll get distracted from that like real fast. So let me start my screen sharing. Okay, and we'll do that. All right. Is that visible?
Yes.
Okay, awesome, thank you. Managing transitions and loss, leading your people through change. Make sure you mute your microphones, please. Thank you. This is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart. I am a certified grief counselor. I was a hospice chaplain for several years and attained my grief counselor status. And so grief and loss transitions have been an important part of my journey in leadership, but also my journey in life, like many of you. If there's one thing that all of us will share, is that we will lose people that we love. And we will have losses that even go beyond our relational losses and transitions that follow. So the books that I am referencing, if I can get my computer to work. There we go. Two books that are formative for me, and Cindy's going to have the information, I think, up on chat, where links where you can order these. Managing Transitions by William Bridges is a book that I've had for well over a decade. It's by my side. It is the best book. As pastors, it's a great resource to preach from and teach from, because he really incorporates the Exodus story in sharing a beautiful way of talking about the three movements of transitions as they relate to loss. Catherine Walsh wrote the book called Grief and Loss, Theories and Skills for Helping Professions. This was one of the textbooks that I had in the classes that I took, and I found it to be most helpful. Very easy to understand, very easy to explain to others. And as you're dealing as a pastor in pastoral care with grief and loss, this might be a helpful resource too. So one of the things that Bridges talks about in his book is the difference between change and transition. Most of us would say, and we hear other people say, we don't like change. The truth of the matter is, it's not change that we don't like, it's transition we don't like. Bridges says that change is happening all the time in our lives and all around us in the natural world. Everything is constantly changing. The law of thermodynamics talks about that. Change is external. It's that which happens outside of ourselves. It could be losing someone that we love, changing a job, moving, other things that we experience in our everyday world. And it's situational, and change tends to happen very fast. We go from this to that thing in the blink of an eye. We wake up in the morning, we think this is what I plan to do. And one phone call changes all of it, right? In the blink of an eye. In contrast to that, transitions are the internal spiritual and psychological tasks that are necessary for us to navigate those quick-paced changes. So when something changes, internally, there's a process that begins spiritually and psychologically to help us adapt to the change. And in that sense, unlike change, transition tends to be very, very slow. It is a long process. It's not linear. Nobody is on the same clock as it comes to change and transition. but there are some principles that will remain true for all of us. So those two things we want to keep in mind: change outside of ourselves, transition inside of ourselves. Transition is very slow, and that's really what I'm going to be talking about tonight. How do we navigate the transitions that come through change? Bridges, in his book, talks about the three movements of transition. And this is where the Exodus story becomes really important. Something ends, right? We leave Egypt. We move into Bridges calls a neutral zone. I like the word wilderness because it feels a lot more like a wilderness than it does neutral. So that would be the wandering around in the wilderness. And then the new beginning that awaits us, which is the promised land. So in transition, these three things are the movements that guide us. When something ends, that's where we begin to feel. Kubler-Ross talked about the 5 stages of grief. There are a lot of other theorists around that. But when something ends, these 5 things and many more begin to surface within us as part of our initial internal response to the ending. When we leave and enter the wilderness, there's another set of things that we begin to deal with. And don't worry, I'm going to come back to these in a moment. I'm just doing a quick presentation of endings, wilderness, and beginnings. But with the wilderness comes a sense of uncertainty and doubt. People tend to become polarized. It's this way, it's that way. This is right, that's wrong. Often in wilderness, there's reemerging losses and trauma. Those things that are unresolved surface and begin to cycle within us. And you can see even a loss of motivation. We can get stuck in the wilderness where we don't want to go anywhere, except, like the people of Israel, maybe go back to the way things used to be, right? If there's any kind of direction that comes in the wilderness, it tends to be backward oriented. You might recognize that in yourself and in some of the people right now in your churches as we continue to move through this pandemic, wanting to go back. You hear that language. When can we go back? When can we go back into worship? When can we go back to normal? When can we go back to doing things that we've always done and enjoyed doing? New beginnings are also characterized not only by happy things like acceptance, hope, and enthusiasm, but skepticism and dread. When I move into a new beginning, it's foreign to me. I'm a little fearful of what might be waiting on the other side of this liminal space, this wilderness, as I step into the unknown. So even new beginnings have their own challenges for us when we are leading people through change and transition. So we all know that we've been living in a time of global grief. I read somewhere that for every person who has died of COVID, there are at least 5 people, very close people who are grieving them. That puts, I think, those who are grieving simply related to COVID at somewhere over 100 million people. It's an event unlike anything any of us have probably experienced in our lifetime in terms of it being so globally oriented. And there has been a complete loss of normalcy all around the world. I meet with pastors in Canada and Wales, in the UK, and I'm hearing the same things from them as I'm hearing from the people here in Harrisburg or Altoona or in the Williamsport district. It is a global human phenomenon. And with it has come a disruption of connection with our loved ones. Still for some, we can't get to the people that we love. I talked to a family whose son lives in Germany. They haven't seen their son or grandchildren in 2 years and don't anticipate being able to see them for quite some time yet. We miss being with members of our church and the friends that we've made there. Also, grief comes from a sense of our own physical limitations. If we've had COVID, if we have long hauler's disease or some lingering effect of it, or even the fear of catching it, this Delta variant. Many of us on this call probably know of persons who died of COVID. We know them by name, we know them by relationship. Maybe it's been some of our own families or friends. And part of the loss is also the economic losses that some have experienced because of the transitions that have come with this change. And then there's symbolic losses. So I'm just painting a picture of the multiple losses that we all are experiencing in our churches and in our personal lives. There are the real losses that have happened, but there's also the symbolic losses, the loss of identity. Who are we now? That we are no longer who we used to be. The loss of a dream or hope for the future. How many of us had to lay something aside that we'd been looking forward to for years because we physically couldn't get there? A loss of a sense of who we were when things were normal, and a loss of symbols or cherished traditions. I talked with a church this week in one of our consultations, and the thing that people identified as one of the greatest symbolic losses for them in their church, I could ask you what you think it might be in terms of worship. The answer I'll tell you is passing the offering plates. They've been receiving the offering in boxes in the back, and it's been working very well, but they really missed the tactile experience of handing the offering plates down the aisle and back and forth. Loss of a cherished tradition and a symbol. Giving our gifts, placing them in a very well-known receptacle. And then if that's not enough, there's the realized grief that we are experiencing. There's the symbolic grief, and then there's the grief that we anticipate. Some of the questions reflected on the screen relate to anticipatory grief. One of the ones right now, what happens if the variants overwhelm the vaccine? And we're hearing about breakthrough COVID cases. I was to consult with a church in Palm Springs, California via Zoom. It got canceled because every staff person there who had been double vaccinated had caught the Delta variant and were homesick. Not nearly as sick as they would have been without the vaccine, but it set them on the sidelines. What we anticipate might happen also causes a sense of grief. You get the picture here of the world in which we live right now. Honestly, I think sometimes it is purely a miracle that any of us are able to get out of bed in the morning and slide our feet into our slippers and stay awake long enough to have that first cup of coffee. The fear, the anxiety, the stress, the worry, all of those things are just a constant and a given in our own personal lives, in our corporate workaday world, and in our communities of faith. We are truly in the same boat. So just a little bit of language here. Grief, when we talk about grief, grief is our reaction to loss. It's the feelings we have when we experience the loss. Mourning is the process that we go through to adapt to the losses or the transitions. So when we talk about what we're experiencing, we hear grief, we experience grief in the way people talk and the way they express their emotions and the way they behave. But the process that we're experiencing in general is really a collective global mourning, a congregational mourning for everything that's happened. And mourning doesn't follow a straight line, and it doesn't follow a calendar. And I just want to suggest that much of the negative behavior, we would call negative behavior, maybe some of the behavior we're not really all that excited about, is because we're experiencing in ourselves and in others grief, and what we're experiencing even in our own congregants and folks who are hanging back from church right now, maybe out of anger with God or a sense of complacency or their own sense of being lost. And we wonder, why haven't they returned? After I just painted this picture of the grief and the mourning that's happening in our lives and the world around us, again, it's hard to get out of bed in the morning, let alone re-engage in another activity that's going to require something of us, no matter how healthy and good it is for us. So if we're not careful, I think we can mislabel grief as other things. And in doing that, we miss the opportunity to offer support when support is what's most needed. So I'm going to give you a moment to look at the screen. And then I'm going to ask you to just in a moment to unmute. You can unmute your microphone and just give me a number. When you look at this list, how many of these things represent some of the feelings and behaviors that you're experiencing, and what is classified as normal grief? These are all very normal things. But when you look at that list, how many of these things are true for you? Take a moment and look at them. And then we'll let you just briefly unmute. You can hit your space button and share a number. I'm going to go turn off a noisy apparatus in my office here. So you can share by unmuting your mic, or if you want to in the chat room, just give me a number. How many of these things are true for you right now?
10.
10.
At least 6 or 7.
Okay.
7 and 11.
Okay.
5.
Mm-hmm. So I'm looking on the chat. Wow, I'm glad I looked up there. There's a lot of numbers. 8, 9, 9, 10, 10, 7, all 14, 11, several 11s, and 7 of 14, all of them, 7, 8, 6, 8, 10, 10. I think that the ones that have surprised me in my own life have been the sense of restless hyperactivity and distracted. Trying to focus and feeling like I need to constantly be involved in something. For me, are feelings that are coming out of this sense of normal grief. Now, what is the point of that exercise except to say that the majority of us on this Zoom call have more than half, have said more than half of these things we recognize in ourselves. And if I were to ask the same question of how many of these things do you recognize in your church corporately, I'm guessing that it will be nearly the same numbers that you shared with me earlier. So how do we deal with this? It's important in the process of mourning to acknowledge the losses. And for us as leaders, I think that means being mindful of what people are being and have been asked to let go of. It means holding space or creating space for open and empathetic conversations. Sitting still long enough with somebody who they could just either be in your presence without saying a word or maybe open up. As I just did a moment ago, I held space for you all by asking you to share a number. And to remember that loss is subjective. And we accept the feelings that are expressed without judgment. And this is it is on here. Resist platitudes. The thing that's not healthy for somebody who is in the process of mourning is to either try and talk them out of their feelings or somehow trying to minimize their feelings, thinking that will cheer them up. The best thing that we can do in our relationships with one another is to acknowledge loss. And when people are expressing their loss in the midst of change, one of the realities for us as churches is that the responses that come out of the mourning and the grieving tend to line up in one of these 4 categories. The early adopters are those who know that the change is happening, who know that nothing is the same, who understand at least mentally that we got to move in a new direction, And they tend to be on board right away. They're the ones who say, okay, tell me what I need to do to help make this happen. And when you have people who are hopefully not denying their own feelings, but I think some people are genuinely, they're just better at, okay, let's figure our way through this. These are great folks to help speak positively about where you are heading into the future, and people who can influence others to stay on board and find their way forward in mission. And if you have folks who have yet to return to in-public worship, in-person worship, and by the way, I think every church is experiencing that. If you have 60% or more of your congregants back in worship already, you're doing better than the average congregation. If you're at 50% or less, you're pretty much average with where the churches are. But if you have these early adopters, these folks who are ready to help lead the church forward, find ways to engage them. These are the folks that you want to maybe empower to phone call those who have yet to return. You don't want to lose touch with those folks. You don't want to pester them, but certainly to say, we really miss you. Is there anything that you need that we can do for you? And just stay in contact so they don't feel as though, well, I didn't come back and nobody missed me. I guess I wasn't all that important. And then you have the honest questioners. What does this mean? And these are people who offer a healthy pushback and often give voice to other people in a healthy way. Not, hey, they're all saying, you're terrible as a leader and you ought to be doing something different. I don't mean that. But these are folks who are able to say, I'm listening to a lot of folks who really are expressing some pretty heavy grief and going through a tough time. The honest questioners are persons that you want to listen to. You want to give them space to be heard, and respond to them positively. I've experienced in any kind of transition in a church, there will always be the quit and leave people. And we may have some quit and leave folks in the midst of this transition that we're in as a church who are just saying, this just isn't for us anymore. We're going to go in a different direction. They're not feeling called or interested in going where this church is saying that it's heading. But the neat thing about quit and leave people is they go without leaving bodies in their wake. They tend to go quietly, they tend to go respectfully, and you want to bless them. And you want to, if you can help them find their next place to do that. The other part of this is, it's not a good idea to demonize them, talk bad about them, or beg them to stay. I find that begging people to do something that they've already decided they don't want to do is counterproductive. And then you have the most challenging people in times of transition are the quit and stay people. These are the folks who fold their arms and say, not in my church. And they're not going anywhere, and they will convince other people to stay and change the leadership or to hold things the way they used to be in stasis. And you've met some of these folks. They speak ill of the church or its leaders, show up during administrative meetings to sow dissent. They try and get a hearing with anybody who will listen, to sour whatever initiative the church feels God is leading them to take. These are folks that you confront privately in love. And I would always suggest 2 people, take somebody with you if you need to confront them in love. Remind them of the vision and the values of the church. This is where we're heading. This is what we believe God is calling them to do, calling us to do. And encourage them to become a part of what God is doing here, or to move on for the sake of themselves and the church. And it's obvious that these are not people that you beg to stay. So there are 4 tasks that come in leading your folks through loss. Helping them accept the reality of the loss. My church will never be the same. And when people say, I'm really afraid that we'll never be the same, one of the kindest things you can say is, nope, Probably not. To process the pain of grief in yourself as a leader, that you yourself will never be the same, that something has changed in you, and giving yourself the space in a very healthy way to deal with that angst. I just confess to you that hyperactivity and I'll confess that for me, I'm right now feeling fearful when I read the news, when I look at what's happening in terms of the Delta variant. I'm supposed to be traveling out to Colorado next week for a few days to help my son in their business. And that fearfulness comes also with a sense of anger. I feel angry too. And I'm not normally an angry person, but I've been really grumpy these days. The best thing I can do is sit and listen to myself, and sit even in the pain for a while. Not wallow in it, at least acknowledge that it's there. And preferably to find someone else that I can talk to about it. Fortunately, I have people like that in my life. To be intentional about staying connected with others, having opportunities to be in fellowship in one form or another, and celebrating the past while charting a course for the future. So we're going to talk about this in a little bit too. Trouble advancing my slides. So when you are helping yourself, your family, your church experience their endings and acknowledge that something has ended in all of this, some of the most helpful things to do is to describe what has changed or will be changing in as much detail as possible. This is true for your church. I'll use the example of the offering. I talked about how the one church can't wait till they get back to the plates. And I talked to leaders who said, we're probably never going to go back to that. It's like, well, have you talked about that with folks? And have you explained to them why you feel this new methodology is much better, healthier, whatever? They may not agree with it, but have you articulated the reasons behind that? Identifying who has to let go of what. What am I losing? What are you losing? Is there a group in the church that's losing a ministry that's been very, very important, but no longer has the volunteer leadership to make it work, or it's no longer a ministry that is as valid as other ministries need to be? Identifying who has to let go of that and paying attention to them as they are navigating that transition. And consider the intangible losses that people might experience. And I know you're probably already doing that as a leader. What are people giving up or feeling like they have to give up? When Kevin Witt and Victoria Rebeck and myself and Kim and other staff persons are working with churches right now, helping them to navigate these transitions, one of the things that we invite and encourage them to do is to help their churches go back to why. Why does the church exist? We've led a couple of retreats recently that we call Clarify, and that's a question that we do a biblical study around it. Why does Jesus say the church exists? We go all the way back to the teachings of Jesus. This is why Jesus started the church. What does that mean for us here? And this is an excellent opportunity in this time of transition to do that. Go back to those foundational documents and to remember and remind ourselves this is why, and then begin to chart the future according to that why. When we are moving away from something, when things are ending, we want to mark those endings. Never speak ill of the past. Respect and celebrate it as much as possible. Ceremonialize the ending as a legacy. And one of the phrases that I like is resist mummification. When I was a student pastor in Ohio during seminary, I had a family in the church who called me one time and said, hey, you have a neighbor. This was a crossroads farming community of 15 houses. You have a neighbor 4 doors down from you. I don't know if you've met her yet. I was fairly new to the church, but I'd really like for you to stop in. She lost her husband about 2 years ago, he died, and she's really become a recluse. And so I knocked on the door, and she opened the door and let me in. And when I went in, everything in that house was exactly the way it was the day the man died. His slippers, his newspaper, his pipe in an ashtray, a cup sitting by the table at his side for 2 years. There are attempts, or at least there's a desire at some points for us to mummify the church so that we retain everything that exists. And even though we've had to let go of it, we still don't want those traditions to end. We still want to find some way to keep it very much in front of us. And there are ways to celebrate the past. And one of the things is to ceremonialize the ending. Find ways to celebrate the things that we used to do, and to offer thanks to God in some kind of a service where we're moving away from those things. We're not doing them anymore. We're not going to be passing plates around. But let's talk a little bit about what that meant for us, and how many of you had that task of taking the offering, and what's the funniest thing that ever happened? What's the strangest thing anybody ever put in a collection plate? Just inviting those kinds of stories so people can remember, and then offer prayer and let it go. When one of my churches early on in ministry moved from a leadership structure of over 60 people, council of ministries, administrative council, and all that, before simplified structure was a thing, I worked with them for 2 years as an associate to redesign their leadership team from that large group to a team of 16 persons. And it took a while to navigate that. And one of the things that we did is we actually had a memorial service for the old leadership structure. And we had liturgy, and we had the senior pastor who offered reflection and scriptural opportunities for challenge. People talked about what it meant to serve on the teams, and who used to be around the table, who now gone to be with the Lord, all of those kinds of things. We didn't want to rush past. We didn't want to just end and walk away from it. We wanted to mark the ending. Anything that we can do to help our people do that, the better it's going to be for us to make the transitions, especially as we prepare to enter a wilderness where there's a lot of things that are not known. So what might it look like to respect and celebrate your church's past without mummifying it? In Western North Carolina, there was a church, there is a church called Hall Creek Commons now. The traditional church that was there underwent through severe decline. They reinvented themselves in a very new style of ministry. Rockville Church in Harrisburg is doing this right now. They're stripping their sanctuary, moving pews. They're converting their pews into bar top table height stations within their worship space. And Hall Creek Commons did that. But one of the things that they did, because they still had a congregation in that, they took one of the Sunday school rooms and turned it into an archive room where they took the most cherished items of the church and they put them on display. The original church sign, the original pulpit, acolyte books, stoles, the candle lighters, some of those kinds of things. And the cool thing is they actually, they took one of the pews and they had craftsmen that turned it into a table. And that became a meeting space for some of the older members of the church to gather for fellowship, for Sunday school, for small groups, who still needed to be able to go into their space to share life together. It was probably one of the most clever things I've seen a church do as a way of respecting and celebrating the church's past. Without saying mummifying means that those things are going forward in our future. No, they're in the past, but we celebrate how meaningful they've been for us. So as an ending occurs, a wilderness begins. We talked about some of these characteristics already on one slide. Think about the story of Exodus, all the things that happen in the wilderness with God's people. When we are managing God's people through this time of wilderness, we remember that people can deal with understandable change if, first of all, it's understandable, and if they're able to see the changes as part of a larger plan or vision. That's part of what navigating loss and transition is going to mean for you in leadership. is finding ways to articulate again and again, and in many ways as possible, how this change that we may be talking about, or we're already experiencing, the change of going online and having online worship, and not getting rid of that now that we're back in person, but that needs to continue because there's a whole congregation we've reached out there. Well, there are churches that want to be done with that. It's like, we don't need to do that anymore because now we're all back in the building. No, this is a change that ought to be permanent. But how can we help them see it as part of a larger plan or vision, to understand that we've now created a second worship service. We've expanded our reach for the kingdom through what we've done together. It's not all about us. Helping people understand the value and power of liminal spaces, which is what a wilderness is. I'm tired of liminal spaces personally. I've always thought in my life I could handle them well. I'm finding it's exhausting. I either want to go backward or forward. It's being in some sense of stasis and waiting for things to happen is just untenable. But in the liminal spaces, the in-between spaces of things, the reason I think it's so challenging for me and for people that I work with, it's because in the liminal space, we're finally beginning to hear our own hearts. We're finally getting in touch with some of the stuff that we've been carrying around with us. We're forced to face some of the dark nights of our own souls in the liminal space because things are just so unclear. And sometimes God's voice is just very, very silent. And we don't even know our own selves or where we are. My mother used to talk about being discombobulated. We're so discombobulated, we don't even know how pieces of our lives fit back together again. Liminal spaces are powerful times for the Holy Spirit to be at work in our lives. If we will give ourselves to them and embrace some of the silence and the quietness and the angst and the anxiety, and question God at length what it all means. So in a sense, I really do think as pastors and staff in this time of liminal space or wilderness, we are called to become spiritual directors for our congregation. Spiritual directors come alongside others. They don't tell them what to do, but they help them to listen to God's voice speaking into their lives. They help them to listen to their own hearts. They help them to be still long enough with spiritual practices, even in worship, to just allow them to be uncomfortable in silence. In communicating, we can't emphasize how important that is, especially in a wilderness, because if it's cloudy and we don't know where we're going and it's hard for us to see, then being clear about communicating where we are, what's happening, and where we're heading over and over and over again is really important. A lack of communication will make this so much harder for people and for you. So when we are leading in the wilderness, leaders guide, but don't rush people through liminal spaces. And if we can think about that in terms of even how we design worship, is there space in our worship for people to just sit in a liminal moment and not rush on from one thing to another through worship, carefully choreographed? Leaders help people manage their anxiety and explore new possible identities and pathways. That's part of that spiritual directing work. And I would add that leading effectively in this time is dangerous and exhausting. And I hear that from pastors because people are generally not happy with the one who guides them through the hard but essential work of loss. Moses took a beating in the work that he had to do. He was not the most popular person in the camp, but it was his task to guide them through the hard but essential work of the wilderness, helping them to let go and end, to step into this liminal space and then prepare them for the future. Someone wrote this, I don't even know where I got it from, but leaders need to let go of their own egoic need to look and be successful and lead instead from a place of wonder and curiosity. to be able to say to your folks, I don't know exactly what the future holds for us. Like you, I'm looking out over the horizon, I'm praying and I'm listening for God's voice, and together we will hear God's voice, and together we will find direction and we will follow. And here's a sense of what we're hearing so far, right? That's part of it too, is God is speaking. We're not just waiting for God someday to speak. Here's what we're hearing and sensing, and we're working together on that. But to even ask the question, I wonder what that's going to mean for how we relate to our community. I wonder what that means in terms of some of the things we've always done and whether we need to keep doing them that way. I think when a leader expresses wonder and curiosity, when the leader owns up to their own sense of unknowing, that's refreshing for church folks. Frustrating at times because they might want the answer, they might want to know the answer right now, but you don't have the answer right now. And I say to folks, if anybody comes to you and says with clarity they know exactly what the post-pandemic church needs to look like, I would turn the other way because I haven't met that yet. I've read all kinds of books and I'm certainly not that person. And you probably aren't either. I thought of the song at dinner tonight, many things about tomorrow I don't seem to understand. But I know who holds tomorrow and I know who holds my hand. There is that certainty, right? And to be the non-anxious presence in the room as a leader is vital. If people are freaking out in the room, we probably shouldn't be the head of that committee. We shouldn't be the one that others have to calm down and take care of. We will have those moments. I'm not saying don't be vulnerable, but find your place of vulnerability. Most of the time, congregations right now are looking for the non-anxious presence in the room. One of the things that I appreciated so much about Bishop Park and serving on his cabinet was his non-anxious presence. And the dean of our cabinet is a non-anxious presence. In fact, our cabinet members just excel in this. And that's the kind of leadership that we need in our local churches too. So we have endings, we're in the wilderness, and we're moving toward new beginnings. And the new beginning is something we know very little about. We're getting a sense of it. We're moving forward when we have some inclination about the new thing that God is doing. Behold, I do a new thing, can you perceive it? And we're beginning to perceive that. And when we're willing to start driving some stakes in the ground or handholds along the pathway to guide others, it's important in these new beginnings to explain why we might be doing something differently or why we're going to do something in a brand new way. Again, I'm going to come back to online worship because we're not done with this yet. And I'm sensing that some churches are retreating a little bit. We may need to explain why, as a new beginning, this is the new frontier of evangelism in a highly tech virtual world. And if we let go of it, we are perhaps letting go of the most important tool that we have, that God has enlivened us to communicate the gospel. So explaining why and in picturing, sharing how it will look and feel, being able to draw visual images for folks so that they can begin to picture it and then lay out a step-by-step plan as leaders for how you move forward. And then the parts, so purpose, picture, plan, and part. Give people a part to play in the time of transition and the new beginning. I've had people who have said to me, I got this great idea for a ministry, and I really think it could be part of the future that God has for us. And my standard admonition is, find 5 people who will share in that with you. Find 5 other people that God might be speaking to who are similarly called. Talk about what you are experiencing together as you pray. Offer that up to God, and then come and tell us about it. Let us in on it, right? Invite people to dream wildly, to think outside the boundaries of what has always been, and to find their part in it. And their part might not be at a committee. It might not be in one of your current established ministries. There might be new things on the horizon that your folks will be leading forward, wanting to become a part of. So to manage in this new beginning, as you begin to navigate your way there, be consistent, be crystal clear and over communicate. Ensure quick successes, set goals and strategies initially that your folks can, targets they can hit easily, and then celebrate like crazy. And find a way to symbolize the new identity of who you are becoming as a church. I had a thought in mind about that I'll come back to, but when something new is emerging, whether it's a logo or a theme or a tagline or a why statement, symbolize that, whether it's a logo or something that's designed on butcher paper and you hang up on the wall that you invite people to participate in. One of the things that that I do in some of the art stuff when I'm working with groups is I'll draw a tree, and I did this with the cabinets, and then I have cut out different colored leaves, and as a way of symbolizing something. You can have them symbolize their losses this way. Have that tree up in the sanctuary on an easel, or tape it to a wall, and invite people to write down on a leaf what it is they've lost, what they feel like they have to let go of, what they're grieving. And then during an act of worship, come and with double-sided tape stick that on the tree, so the tree becomes populated with these leaves. And maybe then somewhere down the line, when you're symbolizing, you got a sense of a new identity of this emerging thing that's happening in your midst, to invite people to write what they're sensing or seeing, or words that describe their excitement or maybe even their fear about the new thing. And again, populate that tree with more leaves. So you've got this tree that's just full of leaves that your people are posting there to symbolize the activity of God in their midst. And then celebrate that. Celebrate that. Leave it up for a while. Celebrate all this activity that's happening and talk about how worthwhile it is. And then strengthen the corporate relationships by having fun. Oh my gosh, I don't know what that will look like in your community of faith. I haven't been in a church yet, because we've been working in churches on the weekends where it's been about celebration, but I know there are opportunities to do that. Find ways where your church can have fun together, and then rinse and repeat. Just keep this process going time and time again as you manage the new beginnings. So I'm going to review these quickly, and then I'm going to do some Q&A. Cindy, are you monitoring the chat room? I'll come back to it in a moment. But some things that I think are really important is to celebrate the past by honoring it. Never speak in a deriding way about what used to be. Allow people to reminisce and tell stories. It doesn't threaten what you're doing in the present or where you're moving in the future. It's honoring them and what was important in their lives. Ceremonialize endings. The tree is an example of that. When you invite people in one way or another to talk about what has ended, or what the church has had to let go of, or any of those kinds of things, anything that you can do to get them up moving around, or visualize it and then see it again and again from time and time again, I think could be very, very helpful. Again, consider what people are being asked to let go of. Keep that in the back of your mind as a leader. It'll remind you that this is a congregation that is mourning, because these are human beings that are mourning at multiple levels. And be careful how hard you push them, or what you might expect of them. If they don't seem terribly excited over a new idea right now, it might be that there's just, they're still dealing with all this stuff too. It'll take a while to come around to that. Empathize rather than criticize. An old thing I learned when I did selling before I was in pastoral ministry is sell the problem before you offer the solution. If people don't know what you're trying to fix, they're not going to buy what you're trying to sell. Communicate, 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 and be as detailed as possible about any changes that you consider making. Regulate the pace of loss so that people are not being asked to exceed their loss tolerance. If you realize that your church is just humming on loss right now, and people are just expressing grief over so many things they've had to let go of, style of worship or other things, be careful about adding more and more to those spread other changes that may need to be made out over time so that people can move through their pace of grief and loss work. Keep the big picture in mind. Help people to know it's normal to feel this way. I hear myself saying that more and more to people. You know, that's absolutely normal. I feel that way too. I have those same concerns, those same experiences. We don't want them to feel like they're on their own. And help people find the right help for their anxiety and pain. You might want to consider a mental health professional come and lead some kind of a fellowship event in your church, or continue a conversation like this. If you sense that some people in your congregation are experiencing abnormal grief, you'll recognize it, because when we move into abnormal grief, we tend to get stuck on certain elements of grief and can't get past it. We can't get past the anger. We can't get past the intolerable sense that we feel within ourselves, almost to the point of self-harm. It's a good idea to know in your community where are the mental health professional resources, so that you can refer people to them if necessary and when the time is right. Go through the wilderness with open hands. Children of Israel kept wanting to grab things and hold on to it. Manna is a good example of that, right? Human nature is, I find this, I want to just strong arm it. Now, we want to go through the wilderness with open hands. God will place things in our hands, and God will take things away from us, or life will do that. And it's not our job to close our hands around it, but to walk through this with a sense of openness. And that's a symbol of trusting God, that God will give us what we need, and we will receive it, and we will allow it to flow from us into the lives of others. And just know that old stuff is going to resurface. Some of the things that may have happened in the life of the church decades ago that you thought the church was over, you might hear people talking about them again. Because new wounds tend to open up old wounds. They tend to fire up other things that were not quite resolved. And celebrate everything you can. So let's see. Cindy, do we have questions? I'm looking for my question box. Or comments?
I don't see any questions just yet, Gary.
Okay. So how about if I minimize my screen and then I can see you. I do have some things, spend time reflecting on your own need to grieve. Observe behaviors in yourself and your congregation, and note those who may be experiencing repressed grief or abnormal grief. And if you want or need to, consider scheduling a follow-up call or conversation with me to continue this exploration in your own congregation. There's my conference email address. There's my personal website address that has information about some of the grief stuff that I do there too. So I'm going to stop sharing. Questions or comments or thoughts about any of this? Jason, I see your hand.
I don't know if this is a comment or a question or just you're making me think about grief. I'm a year into this appointment. This is my first appointment. And there are fundraisers that each church do. And the one fundraiser has become a beast. Like, it's very time consuming. It brings in a lot of money. But it physically kills our people. And they are slowly getting to the point where they know that they're going to have to scale back or get rid of this thing. But it's almost like watching someone in hospice, because they talk about it and they kind of go there, but then they back off. So it's interesting as you're talking about grief. I never thought of that particularly as something that they would be grieving, but they are. I mean, they kind of accept it, and then they kind of struggle, and then they pull back, and then they go full force. Like this year's going to be even bigger. And it's like,
Yeah.
no, you just said that you're in bed for a week after you do this thing. So, and I guess the other part to that is, instead of just doing these things, having a purpose to doing it, instead of just having a fundraiser to have a fundraiser, like have a fundraiser for, I don't know, to bless the trailer park down the road with school supply, like
Mhm.
having a purpose beyond that. I think it gives them more energy.
Mhm.
Because even though they're sometimes kind of used to doing things the same way for a long time, I think they do like new ideas. They just have to deal with that grief first before they can see new life, I guess is a way to put it.
And there can be a sense of guilt that comes with having to let go of something that has been that long standing. There's a feeling of deep responsibility that, gosh, I've done this all these years. People before me did it. Why can't I pull it off? I ought to be able to knuckle under and get this thing done. And it's hard.
Yeah.
It's hard. The guilt feelings can be very, very hard. But I think you're right. I think there is a lot of grief associated with that. And I'm hearing that in other churches too. So when you think about that, as you're
Yeah. And then
thinking to those
it's
folks.
fun.
Mhm.
Yeah, the guilt piece, their one top reason is, well, what about people in the community? I mean, they're used to this.
Mhm. Mhm. Right. We're going to let them down. Right. We're failing them somehow. Mhm. Teresa Heiser says similar issues here. Yeah, and I think we all know the inevitable is, as our churches have declined for various reasons, and COVID has really hurt a lot of that. We are going to have to go back to looking at a scale, rescaling things, and asking the question, why are we doing that? Going back to why? Why? Asking, if you go back to that why statement, why do we exist? Then everything that you do has to be held up against that, even the long-standing things. Right? It's like, well, so why do we do this fundraiser? We don't know. Well, how does that fundraiser accomplish this? What reason why we exist? Can we make it accomplish that? And what it would look like to restyle it? Or if it doesn't, perhaps we ought to let go of it. But that figuring that why out is a great lens through which you invite people to see their congregational world and the community around them. I just, now that I can see your faces, I can't implore you enough to be doing the kind of self-care that you need right now as leaders. I hurt for you. I never pastored a church in the midst of anything like this. I don't know what it's like. I pastored a church through 9/11, a brand new church that I was starting. I remember how horrible that was. This is tough. And I don't know how much care you're able to get back from your congregants, but you can't derive all of what you need from them because they have needs as well. Are there any things in particular some of you are doing that you are finding more helpful in terms of your own self-care? Some things that you've made the decision, I need to do this for me.
I don't know if this has anything to do with anything, but I did experience, now this is my first charge. It just started July 1st. I've been preaching from the pulpit for about 20 years, but nonetheless, I ran EMS through this whole thing. And I also worked for a mortuary service. So I seen both sides, and it is a very stressful end to everyone for seeing people as people just being themselves, and seeing churches trying to go through this was just stressful. We were a rural ambulance, so not as busy as some other ambulances were during this time, but you still seen it. And self-care, you're right, it is the most important thing that we can do. But that self-care can also, this the experiences that I have, I think can help others with their self-care. And I'm just looking forward to sharing that and hoping that we can all continue to serve God together and move forward and get out of this thing and continue in our new normal. So that's just a comment that
Yeah.
I thought, yeah.
No, thank you. I appreciate that. And you know, you are the only person who can really monitor your own health and well-being. And a lot of us have learned how to hide our feelings or stuff things down deep enough so that we can function. It will find a way out. I'm speaking as the president of the club here, not just a member. I'm the president. There's a price that we pay for that. So taking the time that you need for you is not a sin. It's a way that you stay healthy as a non-anxious leader. A question was about what do we do for folks who haven't returned yet? Number one, we can't push people to do what they're not ready to do. And I think we do need to give people space. There are folks who are staying away from worship out of concern for their children or their own physical well-being. And unfortunately, folks, the news is not helping us right now. I think we're going to find people begin to step back a little bit again. I'm feeling that way myself. And I think we need to honor people by giving them space, but we also need to turn up the attempts at personal communication and connection, calling them by phone or finding whatever method is most helpful to that person, to just stop by with a little care package to say, we miss you. And, we love you. And we just want you to know that we're thinking about you. Is there anything we can be praying about? Not how come you're not in church and what can we do to get you back, but we love you, we miss you. What can we do? Is there anything we can do to help? What can we be praying for? I have been a little surprised by congregants that I've talked to in the last couple of weeks when they've asked the same question. And when I've suggested, or I've asked the question, how many of you have actually reached out to them? And there wasn't a single person in the room who said they had. Like, okay, well, there's your first step. It's all about relationships. And it can't be the pastor doing all that. I'm looking at the chat room here. Yes, George said, Tony Morgan said we need to focus on the people who are attending. It's not to the detriment of those who are participating online. Okay, I'm not sure exactly, George. Are you saying that we need to focus on the people who are attending, meaning in person and online, but those who have stepped back at this point, we're not going to go too overboard on that?
Yeah, the context he was speaking about was the whole idea that sometimes we get so focused on the people who haven't shown up.
Right.
And we're trying to figure out, okay, what will get that person back in the room? And for right now, maybe we're better off to think about, okay, who is in the room and how do I engage those people who are in the room, but always recognizing that we're not just focused on them. We do have to focus on the other people, but rather than thinking about, well, how am I going to attract people back?
Mm-hmm.
Focus on those people who are ready to be back and give them the attention that they need right now. Does that make more sense?
Yes, I understand. And I would, what I would add to that is that people in your church already have natural connections to some of the folks who are not attending yet. And I think all we need to do is just encourage and invite them. Hey, if you have people that who are not here and you have a relationship with them, would you just find some time this week to let them know that you're thinking and praying for them, thinking about them and praying for them? Make some kind of a simple contact. I don't think it has to be a full-blown campaign of any sort, but your point is that we ought to be focusing on each other because that's how we're going to get through this, on the relationships that we have with one another. And we are responsible for each other inside the church and those who are still at home.
Gary,
Yes.
I'm on the receiving end of that kind of care. My husband is in the end stage of cancer. I'm his primary caretaker. I am worshiping online. I have not gone back to church. We are both immune suppressed, and we are steering clear of people in an enclosed building at this point. But my church members have called. My pastor has stopped. There's a walking prayer group combined with a Bible study that come by the house every once in a while and ring the bell. And then I go out on the porch and we're all masked and they always have a prayer for us. It's a wonderful group. I appreciate the support.
That makes my heart happy, Susan, to hear that. Thank you for sharing
Thank
that.
you.
Well, it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work to manage our own lives and the lives of our family members and then our congregants as well. And rely on the help of others. Don't try and do it all on your own. And you're the people, as George was saying, the people who are back in in-person worship and are able to share and celebrate the community of faith within that context, I think are uniquely equipped then to, as they're finding that care and support for one another, to carry that back out in the world. And as long as everything we do goes back out toward the world around us, we're on the right track. And the world is watching. And I'll tell you something, Susan. I don't know which church you're a part of, but I can guarantee every person that you know who isn't a part of that church has probably already heard how important that church is to you. And that's a witness for your congregation that won't come from the pulpit, but it comes through personal testimony, and that elevates people's appreciation and understanding of how the church can be significant. And wow, if we only had more of those stories going on out there. It's powerful. Well, we are past our time, and I want to honor that, and I appreciate you sticking by a little bit. So Cindy posted the 2 books, Managing Transition and Grief and Loss. If you want a copy of this PowerPoint, please just send a note to Cindy. I need to go back through it and make sure that everything I have in it is not going to violate any copyrights in terms of some of the materials that I put in it. I just need to double check that. We have the recording too. So anyway, if you want it, we'll make it available in one form or another. But thank you for being here tonight. And may God bless you in your journey, your own personal journey through endings and wildernesses toward new beginnings, and certainly God's blessings on your community of faiths as well. Good to see you all. Take care. Be well.
Thank you.